Hey everybody, I am Alex Cohen.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And welcome to the latest edition of the Inside the Issues podcast. So much to discuss. Once again, we are a month out now from the beginning of the war between Israel and Hamas, and still there are big reverberations happening here. We will talk about that.
Absolutely. And we must talk about some new polling that has come out showing dwindling numbers for some Democrats, for President Biden, as well as Governor Newsom.
Yep. And in the local politics, some really fascinating stuff continues to be happening at City Hall. We will fill you in on the latest of someone commonly known as Staffer B. But let's jump right into it. And at the very get-go, we're going to do our regular segment because it really is something that, even though we're talking international, state politics and local, this is something that just kind of stampedes right through it all. Sara, what's the word?
The word is topsy-turvy.
Yes, and you coined this word because we were just like, is Mercury in retrograde? Yeah. What is going on? Because it really seems like up is down.
Yeah, the world is like all over the place.
Yeah.
I don't even know where to look anymore. Every time I open social media, I feel terrified and frightened.
Yeah, as well you should. And I think one of the most recent and salient examples of that is something that happened Wednesday evening at the Museum of Tolerance on Pico Boulevard. You may have heard about this. There was a screening of a 47-minute long video. This is a film called Bearing Witness. It was put together by a unit of the Israeli Defense Forces. This was about what happened on October 7th in Israel. And this was a screening that was put together by Wonder Woman herself, the Israeli actress Gal Gadot, who's married to an Israeli filmmaker.
Right.
And, you know, even when folks first got wind of this on social media.
Right. Folks were calling for protests outside. And I think this is the topsy-turvy part, right? Like, we're protesting outside of the Museum of Tolerance, right? I'm like, wow, this is just already a wild thing to wrap my head around. But, you know, the film, of course, was a documentary about the brutal attacks, much of it coming from the body cam footage from Hamas militants who led that attack. Of course, brutal imagery. I didn't see it myself, but what has been reported is brutal imagery of the attack and the murders of innocent civilians and children on October 7th. Yeah. And of course, as we have seen now for several weeks here in Los Angeles, this pro-Palestinian movement, you know, making a call for folks to come out and protest outside of the Museum of Tolerance. However, pro-Israeli protesters also came out, and things got a little tense.
And if you missed it on social media, let's take a look. This is one of the pro-Israel demonstrators who showed up to witness what was happening outside of the Museum of Tolerance. And he came across some of the demonstrators there who were on the pro-Palestinian side of things. Let's take a look.
Terrorist Hamas. The pepper spray young kids because they feel guilty. They kidnap people and they feel guilty. They spray these young kids with pepper spray because they feel guilty. They are terrorists. That's why they keep taking the poster down.
Sara, there was something about the whole thing, right? The helicopters flying overhead. You see a lot of these protesters in masks and hoodies and glass. It a very 2020 kind of vibe to it. I have my cortisol levels just went up watching it and listening to it in a way that I hadn't really experienced since then. Yeah,
you know, and I had messaged you over the weekend. I was in downtown LA, and there were large protests happening there also. And you know, I agree, right? I think the masked folks that come out masked, it does feel very much like some of the protests from 2020. But even before that, I mean, I can recall immigration rallies that went awry back in the day, and it was often the folks that were masked. I'm not saying it's the same folks, but that imagery of it. You know, I was at the immigrant rights rallies back in must have been 2007. Peaceful rally and march, families, children, and folks kind of got out of control. LAPD coming, shooting rubber bullets at us, folks having to run. There was a huge lawsuit afterwards as well. And there is something very eerie feeling about that moment when things just feel like they're at a pressure cooker point and you just don't know what's going to happen. And of course, we've been seeing this. So just earlier last week, we saw also in Ventura County at Westlake Village, a similar kind of protest happening, pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian, and they clashed with an individual actually leading to his death.
Yeah, it was struck with a megaphone, fell back, and gosh, so much to say. First of all, when it comes to this particular clash that happened outside the Museum of Tolerance, especially after what happened at Westlake Village, Sarah, when I first heard Gal Gadot is hosting this screening, people were calling for folks to come out and protest. I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach. Is someone going to die again?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And there were fistfights that broke out. The LAPD was quick to stop them. Apparently, these were fights that there were some clashes between protesters when the film was being screened. LAPD kind of quieted down, and then they came back. It's been really interesting reading the LAPD statements that have come out of this, because you see how even the LAPD, I mean, I get this as a journalist, is struggling so hard to keep the language so neutral. And in that incident, in the death of the man in Westlake Village, we know he was struck in the head. We know that he fell backwards. And beyond that, there is such cautious language being used, because even I saw there was a statement from the local affiliation of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. And Hussam Meloush, the director there, was talking about how devastated they were to hear that anybody had died, but was very quick to say, and let's not politicize it, because we are in this topsy-turvy moment where the slightest little imbalance, if there was a judgment made about who was responsible for the death of this man in Westlake Village, when we don't know all of the facts, you see how dangerous that could become. This screening, which, by the way, I should also note, in the end, Gal Gadot
didn't show.
She was not there.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was concerns about safety or what was going on.
And there was some speculation. SAG-AFTRA, of course, ended the months-long strike, and perhaps some of the celebrities weren't there due to that. It's unclear exactly why she wasn't there.
But we're seeing, continued now. We are a little more than a month out from the beginning of this most current conflict and war, and it's still having such ripple effects. And one of the things there that we heard in that video that was posted on the Citizen app, he said, they are terrorists. They keep taking the posters down. And if you didn't catch what that reference is what we're seeing lately is on a lot of college campuses, there are these kind of missing posters that have been put up of Israelis who have been kidnapped by Hamas. And then we have seen some of those siding pro-Palestinian supporters tearing those posters down, and then people video those, and then they make the rounds on social media, and it's just this kind of tornado, it feels like. And Sara, I feel like you're in the eye of this tornado because you are on a college campus. What's the vibe like there lately?
Well, definitely. We're seeing so much pro-Palestinian momentum on college campuses. And I think there's a real difference about when you see all of the students going out and participating in these protests. And I think the vast majority of those students are really just concerned about Gazans. And let's be real, right? Over 10,000 Gazans have died at this point, many of whom are women, children, and civilians. And so I think the vast majority is actually about that. But there are those small numbers amongst them who feel and want to glorify Hamas. And that is a small component of it. And that often gets amplified as being the epicenter of all of it. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. And I think there's a difference between when you see all of the students there and when I'm talking with students one-on-one, there's actually a deep searching for nuance amongst many of them, not all. These are young folks who often see the world in black and white, and they're at this point where they're, trying to figure out who they are as
it's a topsy-turvy time
right?
for them.
It is a topsy-turvy time for them also. And as an educator, I'll say this, I had shared with you last week, actually, that I ended an affiliation, an academic affiliation that I had because they voted to put out a statement saying that it was in my opinion, a pretty harsh statement, is supporting Gaza. And that's not to say I don't support Gazans, but as an educator, I just don't. I feel like it has that silencing effect on other students. And if we talk about inclusive classrooms, then I, as an educator, have a responsibility to make sure all of my students, regardless of what perspective or opinion that they have or what religion that they are, feel safe in my classroom to be present, to participate. This week, what we saw was here in California, many Jewish lawmakers from the Jewish caucus came out with a statement pushing back at the UC systems and the CSU system, saying they're not doing enough to protect Jewish students from anti-Semitic violence that might be occurring on campus and the kind of silencing that might be happening for Jewish students as well.
And I think, they put out, the California Jewish Legislative Caucus put out this letter to the UC regents and the chancellor of the CSU system. And, I've often said it on this podcast before, Sara, like, there's a reason I'm not in politics. I'll also say there's a reason I'm not in academia, or at least not on that level, because I think that's really hard. I mean, it seems to me that, college campuses in so many ways, especially here in California, right? Like, we're home to UC Berkeley, like the epicenter of the free speech movement.
Right.
So you've got like this great drive for freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And you've got all of these kids, and I say kids in the sense like many of them aren't there allowed to drive and drink and vote. But, there is research that show the brain isn't really even fully developed until you hit 25, right? But this is at a point where you've got Californians or people living in California who are really trying to figure out who they are as people and figure out what their identity is and what their politics are. And yet they're still young and may not know everything. And to try to think that somehow you could legislate that or regulate that, I think it's a little topsy-turvy, right? Like, whose job is it to step in, and how do you draw those lines between protecting the safety of Jewish students and letting everybody have freedom of expression? I'm really glad that is not my job, that it is my job to talk about it instead, because I think it would be really hard to do.
Yeah, it's not easy, but I for me, at least thus far, I feel like I have a lot of open conversations with my students, and I'm very thankful and fortunate to be on a liberal arts campus where, as professors, we know our students very well. Students feel very comfortable and confident coming in and talking with professors, and I think we have a lot of great conversations about these difficult topics because of it.
Well, speaking of UC Berkeley, not only are they the epicenter of free speech, they were also home to what's called the Berkeley Institute on Governmental Studies. And they put out polls all the time. They're not the only people surveying California voters, but they do some interesting work. And they had a new poll that came out this week with some numbers about Governor Gavin Newsom. He has now hit his all-time disapproval rating high of 49%. His approval rating is 44%. And honestly, that's kind of half a half in my book, really. But back in February, the same survey found that Gavin Newsom's approval rating was at 55%. And the LA Times, I can't remember what the exact headline was, but it was like, all time. It seemed very dramatic. Like, everybody hates Gavin Newsom. And I don't think it was that. But in terms of, maybe not enjoying the same popularity that he once did.
Right. Remember, Gavin Newsom came through that recall election a couple of years ago swimmingly, right? I mean, people were concerned, perhaps, can he do it? Oh, yeah, he sure did. And had this strong approval ever since. So it is notable, I think, to see this decline, particularly on the back of him having gone to China, having gone to Israel, and some somewhat negative headlines, I think, to some extent, about, is it appropriate for him to go? Is it?
Which we've talked about a couple of weeks ago. Whenever that happened, go listen to that episode if you haven't. Right. And this poll actually asked people specifically about that. Not just that, but also the fact that, Gavin Newsom, he's set to debate Ron DeSantis later on this month. How do you feel about him taking on this bigger role on the national stage? 45% of the voters that they surveyed approved of this, thought this was a good idea. 43% opposed. And again, that's a pretty interesting Rorschach test of a lot of Californians being like, you go, Newsom, you go out there, and if you can be the guy that,
go be the
takes
bulldog
on Trump
for the Democratic Party.
Do it, right? But not everybody's on board. And this is something that you hear especially among Republicans all the time. Like, this ain't your job, buddy, right? Like, why are you
Why are you here?
California's on fire. Look at our gas prices.
Yes.
Look at inflation, and you're gallivanting all over the place. You really need to be here instead. His China trip, 50% approved, 39% disapproved. I feel like that's a bigger margin. You know, a lot of people really did like the fact that he was speaking out about climate change, an issue that's still very important, even though there's so many other issues right now for folks to contend with.
Yeah, exactly. And there also seemed to be strong support for the proposition, Prop 1, that he is pushing on the March ballot, which would be a $6.4 billion mental health bond. That so far seems like there's strong support for that as well. So his policies are still seem to be quite popular amongst California voters, but perhaps he's hit that lull at this point in his governorship.
So I think, again, another topsy-turvy situation is policy person, policy politician. And there's another poll out this week from the Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies. And this one is about Joe Biden. President Biden's job ratings have declined and are now underwater in California for the first time in his presidency, with more voters now saying they disapprove of his performance overall. That's 52%, then approve, 44%.
Right. And this is at the same week that the New York Times Siena College poll came out, finding that Trump is ahead of Biden in 5 of the 6 swing states, which I think came as a huge shock to a lot of folks. While at the same time on Tuesday this week, nationally, thinking nationally just for a minute, we saw Democratic wins, big wins in places like Ohio and Virginia and Kentucky, which, you know, leads to this kind of topsy-turvy world that we seem to be living in which Democrats are doing well at the ballot box this time around, but questionable in these polls.
And the numbers on the economy are actually really good, and yet people still feel
the
like
perception is not so great.
No. And I think how much of it is just because of this person. In the case of Biden, still these conversations around his age and whether or not he's really up for the job. And just like, and I don't know, like if your kids say this word, the Riz, right? Like I don't think Biden has much charisma, right? In the way that a Barack Obama might have had.
Right.
And like it or not, Donald Trump has...
He's got charisma.
He's got a certain riz for a certain crowd of people. So
for the Roseanne Barrs of the world, apparently.
Yes, who was there at his rally in Florida this week. And I think, you know, for Newsom, again, it's that personality that really rubs. Like, some people think it's great and all of his big words and run-on sentences and whatever.
And his shiny hair and the shiny teeth.
Right. And some people love it, and a lot of people just really not
it
so
turns
much.
Them off. Yeah.
I also, like, Sara, another thing that's just so topsy-turvy to me is that what started off, I feel like, months ago as this seemingly sounding wacko notion that Gavin Newsom was going to be the Democratic nominee, I feel like that just keeps getting more and more and more and more and more play and going louder and louder, to the point where I was watching CNN after the debate this week, and Dana Bash was talking to Vivek Ramaswamy, and he just kept talking about, why is Gavin Newsom on a plane? And why is he going to all these places? And why? And it was just so strange. It was like we're at a debate in Miami, and yet you're talking about Gavin Newsom,
the California governor, right? Like, right. It is a bizarre kind of place.
But that same New York Times Siena College poll that you mentioned that came out found that an unnamed Democrat, right, would, even though Trump was way ahead of Biden in a lot of these contests, if it was an unnamed Democrat against Trump, the unnamed Democrat, I picture one of those, you know, when you just get like the box with the gray picture and you don't upload your profile. But like, that person
you can just see
would
Gavin
be Trump.
Newsom's like hair,
right?
Hair.
It's crazy. Like, that person would be Trump. So it's super fascinating. I'm not ruling it out now. When someone was like, do you think Gavin Newsom will be the nominee? I was like, heck no.
Yeah, someone just asked me that this morning. I was like, of course not. It doesn't work that way. And I'm like, oh, maybe.
But in a topsy-turvy world.
Yeah, exactly. I want to note one other topsy-turvy thing coming out of that national poll was black voters in that poll. 22% for Trump, which is outrageously high coming out of the civil rights era. We haven't seen numbers like that for a Republican candidate in decades. And this is, of course, a trend that has been happening since 2016. We've been seeing this momentum and slow movement, particularly of Black men, of Latino men as well, making this shift towards the Republican Party. Could really be noting some sort of racial realignment that might be starting to happen and shift within our political system.
It's so fascinating.
Yeah.
There was actually at the Trump rally in Florida, as Donald Trump was warming up the crowd, he was saying that the real insurrectionists were not the folks who showed up in D.C. on January 6th, but instead were the protesters who took to the streets after the death of George Floyd. And one of the most vocal supporters of that sentiment was a Black guy that was standing behind him. And at one point you see, Don Jr. being like, you could probably say this even better than I could. And I thought that moment, even more so than anything that Donald Trump said, was really illustrative. I could talk about this all day, but we got to talk about what's happening locally.
Always fun times at City Council.
Talk about topsy-turvy. All right. So we're going to talk about John Lee, City Council member from the far reaches of the San Fernando Valley. Last month, the LA Ethics Commission accused him with a whole bunch of ethics violations, accepting gifts in excess of a gift limit, failure to report gifts, misusing his city position, aiding and abetting another person's misuse of a city position. That would be Mitch Englander, he used to work for. He got things like bottle service or saying dinner, hotel rooms, casino chips, and all sorts of things.
Sounds like a wild night in Vegas,
Yeah. So they've got this ethics commission that is moving forward, but then topsy-turvy, what does Lee do?
Lee brings a lawsuit on the
Ethics
Commission with, and I love this part too,
this is good,
with the attorney Faisal Gill, who had run for city attorney last year and was the more progressive candidate than Heidi Feldstein Soto, who won that race. John Lee not really being aligned with the more progressive left of the right. I mean, former Republican, now independent.
Sarah,
I think
everybody's got bills to pay. Even Faisal Gill.
Clearly. Topsy-turvy world.
Very
for
topsy-turvy.
Sure.
So the Ethics Commission just voted this week. They're going to move forward with this hearing. There was apparently part of the lawsuit, too, I should note, was about, they said that the city took too long to launch the complaint because these things allegedly happened in 2016, 2017. It is now 2023. I believe there's usually a 4-year statute. The Ethics Commission said, well, we didn't even know this was happening then because he kind of concealed it.
Right.
So I don't know. Anyway, this is messy. There will be a hearing happening at some point. People noted there was real impacts to this because when he ran for re-election, people didn't know about this, and there might have been implications to that. Very interesting is now John Lee runs for re-election. Sarah, you were with me when I did my State of the Valley thing that I do every year, and I had this question. I get to choose which council members I ask about too, and the question was about ethics, and I said, will there be another bombshell dropping?
And here it is.
For a reason. And do you remember his answer? I sure hope not.
Yeah. I bet he did not. Hope not.
Yes, exactly. So we'll keep an eye on that for sure.
One other local politician winding up in hot water this week was an assembly member who was vying for a city council. Well, maybe still is vying for a city council district.
You texted me on this one. You had the tea before anybody else.
Assemblymember Wendy Carrillo was booked by LAPD at 1:30 in the morning, approximately, after crashing into two cars, booked on suspicion of a DUI. ABC News coming out with footage of that sobriety test in which she could barely walk.
And she said she sneezed and lost track of the vehicle. And then later on, they found that her blood alcohol was in the
twice the legal limit, about twice the legal limit.
Pretty high.
Yeah, really high.
And so, interesting. You texted me. There was the police report went online, and then soon after it came out, and she released a statement, talking about accepting responsibility for it. And, I think a lot of people were wondering, okay, is she still going to run? She had announced her candidacy, but then I guess just this week was the official paperwork filing time.
So I'm curious if she was able to.
She officially is in. Yeah, no,
okay,
she's officially in. Yeah. And I got to say, every time, I can't remember if we've talked about this on this podcast or not, but I want to recommend a great book, came out years ago by a British author named John Ronson, called So You've Been Publicly Shamed. Yeah. And what he did was he took it was roughly 12, 14 instances of people who had really landing in it, right? The woman who got on a plane to South Africa is like joking on social media, oh, I hope I don't get AIDS. And by the time she landed, had lost her job, had been completely pilloried in social media. And, you know, in just about every one of these instances, someone who gets publicly shamed, someone who messes up, even if they apologize profusely, they kind of never come back from it.
Yeah.
The one person in John's book who comes back from it was a guy in England who, like, I guess was, you know, dressing up in Nazi uniforms and some sex scandal and whatever. And he just, first of all, he had money, never hurts. But the other difference between him and everybody else was he just, nope, and just didn't, like, said, nope, technically they weren't Nazi, they were SS uniforms. Like, just like, was like, nope, I didn't do anything wrong. And on paper, that just, for me, like, morally goes against everything. Like, you teach your kids, you mess up, you take responsibility for it. Right. Except for that will get you nowhere, seemingly.
Well, I think we're going to have to get copies of this book for many of
our politicians.
politicians.
Right. So, Wendy Carrillo is still in the race. You know, by the time it gets to next year, between her and Kevin De Leon and the tapes, and who knows how all of it will shake out.
Indeed.
One last item before we go. Last week on this show, we talked to you about the recall election that's underway now in Santa Ana. This is to recall Councilmember Jesse Lopez, who represents Ward 3. But there's an issue here that has to do with your favorite topic in mind, Sara, redistricting.
Redistricting, indeed. Right. So the county registrar came out last week saying, hey, there's a problem. We don't have enough signatures. They gathered the signatures based on the new lines rather than the old lines, which is actually where people elected her to vote. And they needed to be based on those old lines. The city council moved forward with the election. Nonetheless, a lawsuit was brought, but the judge this week said, moving forward.
Going. The judge decided not to stop it. The council deadlocked. They decided not to stop it. Ballots can be cast through November 14th. So, I mean, stay tuned, right? By the time we join you here next week, maybe the recall will be stopped, but I don't think so.
Yeah, it seems to be
maybe it
forward.
will go on. And if she's not recalled, I don't know. Maybe then people just say, okay, we'll wait to the next election. If she is recalled, I cannot help but think
she would
lawsuits aplenty.
Probably going to fight that, I would assume.
Yes. It is a topsy-turvy world. Folks, let us know what you think about the stuff that we talked about this week. Of course, if there's any California political stories you'd like to hear us chat about, we'd love to hear from you. I am on the social medias at Alex Cohen in LA.
And I'm at Sara Sadhwani.
And we'll see you here next week. The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Nathaniel Leathers is our editor. The executive in charge of production is Jeff Shore.